Hey, welcome, jerks. Mike Crawford, young jerks tonight. What's up, jerks? Hopefully, a few of you are going to be listening tonight. Not covering the Karen Reed stuff tonight, but we will be back. Looks like on Friday night with our 3Ms, the 3Ms. You know who they are: Mazza Media, attorney Mark Betterow, and myself. So it looks like Friday night. I'm not sure on the time. Maybe about 6:30. We'll see. But definitely check that out on Friday night. We'll be back. Tonight, we're going to talk about something different. Another injustice, though. Big thing is it has some similarities to the Karen Reed thing. I believe it's somebody who has been convicted and jailed for decades for a fire, major fire that killed a bunch of people, and it looks like he didn't do it. Looks like the science is proving that this Danvers man, it happened in Beverly, Massachusetts, and I think it was 1984. He was convicted or went to trial in 1989. His name's James Carver. He's been in jail for decades. And I have a reporter who's been on the show in the past. He does some great work on transparency, police accountability. He does a lot of FOIA requests. He gets a lot of information and documentation locally on different cities and towns and state government, which is much needed. He's great at this. I follow him. He's got a website called the Mass Dump. It's an email newsletter website through Substack. You could definitely subscribe to it. I put it in the chat. I'm going to actually pin that in a second when I get him on the show here. But I'll make sure I pin that in the YouTube chat so people can make sure they check out the article that I have on the screen here, but also subscribe to him on Substack. Make sure you're on the email list. Let's bring him up. Andrew Quimere, welcome back to the show, Andrew.
Hey, Mike, how's it going?
Good. How you been? It's been a while.
Pretty good, yeah. I've been doing a lot of work, so I guess that's what I'm here for.
Yeah. How's your website? Because you got this new website. When we had you on before, it was a different thing going on, but now you got the Mass Dump. How has that been going for you?
Uh, I mean, it's been interesting. I've been doing a lot of stuff. I mean, we won't have time to talk about it, but I've been working on like a lawsuit for public records, just doing a lot of interesting work. I feel like I'm kind of expanding my work in some ways, doing more than I used to be doing. And this particular story that we're going to be talking about is like another example of that. This was a lot of work. It was uh, working on it for probably close to 2 years now. This story, and you did a good job teeing this up. This was a fire in 1984 that killed 15 people, which it's if you've ever heard of the Coconut Grove fire in the I think 1940s, this was like the deadliest fire in the history of the state. This is the second deadliest fire since then, or I should say the deadliest fire since then. Um, and it was a really horrific tragedy. So many people died, and it happened at a rooming house, which are sort of not really a thing anymore, but it used to be like a cheap option for housing. You'd have like one room to yourself, you'd share a bathroom with the people on your floor, and a lot of poor people, or as they used to call them, transient people, might live in these places. This particular one had some of the people there were like psychiatric patients who were discharged from Danvers State Hospital, the now closed psychiatric hospital. So a lot of the sort of like people on the margins of society were living there, and it burned down. And it didn't have a sprinkler system installed. It didn't have what are called fire stops in the walls, which would sort of prevent the fire from spreading if it penetrated the walls. It didn't have, or it had rather what's called an open staircase, meaning you open the door to get to the stairway to get to the rooming house on the second and third floor of the building. And then when you get to the top, there isn't like another doorway. It's just opened up, so if the fire gets in the doorway, it can just shoot right up the stairway and spread into the building. It's going to, nothing stopping it from getting to that oxygen and that fuel that's on the inside of the building, once you get past the stairway. So this building was kind of like a fire trap, and people knew it at the time, but the building codes sort of weren't what they are today. So it allowed tragedies like this to happen. But what happened is that they essentially, within a day, officials concluded that this was a case of arson. And then over the next 5 years, they investigated this guy, James Carver, who was just a young man at the time. He was in his like early 20s, I believe. He's now, 60. He's been in prison since like 88, I believe, 88 or 89. He was convicted in 89, but he was, I don't know exactly when he was incarcerated because his bail was revoked. So it's been closer to like 35, 36 years now.
Holy
And
shit.
he has maintained his innocence this whole time for more than 3 decades now. And unfortunately, the way our system works is once they've got you, in the system, it's very hard to get out. And they it's hard to challenge, what was the big issue in this case now anyway is the sort of forensics. We call it forensic science, but unfortunately a lot of forensics is not really based on science. It's just like some guy who comes in and says, "Hey, I'm really experienced," and the judge says, "Well, sure, you seem like an expert to me." And then they get to testify, and if it sounds convincing to a jury, then the person can get convicted. And that's kind of what happened here. Is they had a fire investigator who said that this fire had to have been started with a flammable liquid like gasoline, which if somebody poured, they said it was started on a pile of or a bundle of newspapers in the doorway that or right outside the doorway to this stairway to the rooming house. And he said that there was charring on the walls that could have only been left if someone had poured, gasoline or some other flammable liquid on these newspapers. But it's just it was like an urban legend that existed at the time. People who investigated fires did not have a scientific background. It would just be, like some firefighter or some cop who got trained by some other firefighters or cops, and they would pass down sort of this like folklore about how, how fires started and how they were spread. And some of the stuff was, probably sound, but some of it is just urban legends. Like this stuff, they call it alligator charring because the the patterns in the char, they kind of look like scaly alligator skin. But this, scientists have looked into this stuff in, the decades since the 80s, and it's just total junk science. There's no connection between the way that charring looks and whether or not, gasoline was used to start the fire. And that's kind of just the beginning of it.
Now
There's,
they now they
we'll get
showed
into
there
it,
was,
but yeah.
yeah, there was no gasoline. That's the
Well,
thing, right? They found out
there's
later there was
no
no testing that showed there was any gasoline involved, right?
Well, there were lab tests done at the time that were negative, but the expert guy who testified,
Sad.
he said, well, the gasoline or flammable liquid, it would have been washed away because the firefighters are using all this water to put out the fire. And it's sort of like, well, how do you prove a negative, right? Like, how do you prove there wasn't gasoline? And it's the issue here is they had a guy who said it had to have been gasoline or some other flammable liquid because of these patterns in the char. Um, but if you take that away because it's junk science, you're left with nothing, right? Like maybe there was gasoline. You can't really. Maybe he's right. Maybe it was washed away by the water. But that's complete speculation. There's no actual basis for saying that other than just, well, maybe. So, uh, and the DA's office, this is in Essex County, the Essex County DA's office has actually conceded that there's no scientific evidence of gasoline or any other, they call it an accelerant because it accelerates the spread of the fire. There's no evidence of an accelerant, but they still are contending that James Carver is guilty and does not deserve a new trial, even though this science was, not really science at all. It was just completely flawed, invalid testimony that the jury used to convict him.
And now there's a lot of science that's come out. I mean, it looks like they really only have one piece of evidence against him. It's his own words that he said when he was
Well,
drunk.
that he
We'll
allegedly,
talk
his
about
own
that.
words.
Yeah,
But
we'll
yeah, we'll
talk
get
about
into
that in
that.
a minute. But before we get there, like, because the big part of this for me reading it, you're reporting, and I did put that in the chat. If anyone wants to read the entire article. It's right there pinned at the top in the YouTube chat. You can also make sure you follow Andrew on his Substack. But no, like all the scientific evidence since then basically debunks that he started the fire with the newspapers, doesn't it?
So what's going on right now is what's called a motion for a new trial. So this is once you're convicted, you get one appeal. People sometimes confuse what is happening right now with appeals. You get one appeal. But then once your appeal's over, you have to appeals have to do with legal issues. So if there's a legal issue at your trial, you can appeal based on that. But once your appeals are exhausted, you can challenge your trial by saying that there's new evidence that wasn't available at the time. And if it's evidence that hypothetically could have been available at the time, even if it's compelling, the courts will just say, well, sorry, it's not new. But in this case, they have the new science, that this evidence, supposed evidence of a gasoline isn't, valid. The other piece, though, is they had a hearing for this motion, and James Carver's lawyers presented a expert, like a legitimate expert. He's a fire safety engineer who has actually worked on. Give me 2 seconds. This this is the National Fire Protection Association's NFPA 921 guide for fire and explosion investigations. He's actually has worked on the committee that has written this guide, so he is a respected um, engineer, scientist. He's respected in terms of his contributions to the field, and he basically said it's like physically impossible for the story that the prosecution and police came up with to be true, because um, one thing he said is the fire couldn't have started on the ground where the bundle of newspapers was found, because the burning on the walls of this alcove where the doorway was very superficial. It was like a quarter-inch thick. But the damage to the overhead of the alcove, the little, overhang over this doorway, was like extensive. Like it was literally burned through, and there were pieces of wood that were missing from it. Like basically chunks of the ceiling were missing because of how extensively damaged it was. And he said if the fire started at the ground level, you'd expect much more extensive damage on the walls, as opposed to the area over it being more extensively damaged than the walls. And the other piece he said is that this bundle of newspapers, and I think this is the most compelling point, could not have generated a fire powerful enough to have spread to the walls of the alcove. Because the theory is that you set the newspapers on fire, and then the newspapers are pushed in the corner of this alcove, and then the flames spread to the wall, and then they travel up the wall. They break through this glass window above the doorway, and that's how it gets inside the building. Now, this guy, Craig Byler, this fire safety engineer, he said there has been testing done to find out how much powerful a flame you would need to spread to walls in a corner, like wooden walls, which were, what was present here. And he said you would actually need a like 5 foot tall fire. And if you had newspapers bundled together tightly, even if they weren't bundled together, you're maybe going to get like a, maybe you'll be lucky, you'll get a 1 foot tall flame, right? And it's just, and if you think about this, if like this doesn't make sense, you think about like a block of wood, and you take a lighter to it, you hold the lighter to the block of wood, you might turn part of that wood black, but it's not going to just like catch on fire, right? It's not going to. So think about that in this context. You might get like a relatively small flame from these newspapers, but it's just not going to cause a fire like this. So there had to have been some other cause. And he's also saying that it couldn't have started on the ground. And his theory is that it actually started in the overhang somewhere, but he is saying that basically there isn't enough evidence to actually say what caused it. So he thinks he knows the general area of where it started, but not what actually caused it. And he thinks that the original investigators, because they were like focused on this idea that there had to have been, gasoline or something poured on the ground or on the newspapers, that they basically overlooked this possibility of an electrical fire, and they did kind of look into this, but they did very cursory look. They had some wires hanging in the alcove that you can see in pictures in the articles I published, but they basically they had three guys look at it, like a state trooper, a state electrical inspector, and then this other guy they flew in from New York, who I mentioned, who testified at the trial, who was also a fire investigator. And there's no evidence that the state trooper or the electrical inspector even looked at the wires. And then the other guy from New York, he looked at the wires and he basically just said, I bent them and they were flexible. And if they had caught on fire, they would have turned brittle. And so they couldn't have been responsible for this fire because they were flexible. And according to this fire safety engineer, that's like not he that's not generally it generally isn't how electrical fires start, that you would expect wires to be brittle. So it's just not one, it's like scientifically invalid, and two, if in like a modern investigation of an possible electrical fire, you would have to do like really extensive documentation. You take close-up pictures of every electrical device in the area where you think the fire would have started. You trace the wires back to like the circuit breaker, the fuse box. Um, you take pictures documenting where the wires traveled. You have to document the circuit breaker or the fuse box. And like none of this was done. We have, pictures of the wires from like 10 or 20 feet away, but there's no close-ups. Nobody, you also have to take the wires or other electrical devices back to the lab after you photograph them. You got to look at them in a microscope, and they didn't collect any of these electrical artifacts at all. They didn't even, it's not even clear whether this building had a circuit breaker or a fuse box, because that's how poor the documentation was in this case. So there's just no evidence. There isn't enough evidence to say whether or not it was an electrical fire, because they just didn't really look into the possibility in any serious way.
Crazy. 15 people died. I'm
Hmm.
just reading your story about some of the deaths too. Like one of the guys jumping out the third floor window
Yeah,
and
it's really
hit
horrific
the
stuff.
metal utility box, and he didn't survive. And the whole fam, like this, just horrible, horrible
Yeah,
deaths. People,
three members of one family died in
yeah,
the fire, and one of them, he was a 9-year-old boy who didn't even
visiting.
live in the building. He was visiting the manager, who was his grandmother, and his older brother, who lived with a grandmother. He was from Maine, and he was visiting for like a week or two, and he was the youngest person to die in the fire. It was really sad.
This is was in Beverly, Massachusetts. For people who
Yeah,
know, was it on Rantoul Street? I believe it was.
the corner of Rantoul and Elliott Street. And actually, if you go, it was in July. It's happened in July 4th. So it was just the 40th anniversary earlier this month of this fire.
Oh,
And if you go to the corner of Elliott and Rantoul, it's now a CVS. This building was, I believe, it was partially saved. It was just the upper floors that were destroyed, but they did tear it down a number of years ago, and they put this CVS there. But if you go to the corner, uh, there's a small monument there that has the names of the 15 people who died. And the for the fourth this year, for the 40th anniversary, the fire department kind of cleaned it up, and they left a note there just kind of saying that people should just sort of think about this tragedy, and take a few moments to kind of think about it, and to sort of do something nice for somebody else, to sort of, because just we kind of owe it to victims of tragedies like this to just do better, because like this, what I think is really
incredible.
sad about this is I sort of see this as like a microcosm of the United States, where like in our country we invest so much money in jails, prisons, police, and sort of punishment, and we think of the idea when people talk about public safety in the media, they're talking about like cops, right? They're talking about prisons, but a lot of what constitutes public safety is like safe housing,
Yeah,
dignified housing.
preventing a tragedy like this, like having
It's
smoke detectors
safe
and sprinklers.
workplaces. It's people,
Yeah.
right? And it's preventative measures. Yeah,
Mm.
sprinklers could
It's
have
it's just the
possibly
same
saved
thing
lives in
that
this building.
drives me crazy
Uh,
about the cannabis industry. They don't invest in protecting their workers, and people get sick and die, and nothing's done about it. Just the same. public safety. It's worker safety, being able to live in your home safely without something like this happen. I just want like it's interesting you said that CVS because I've been in that CVS. I had no idea. It's like I'm gonna next time I'm over there, I'm gonna check out that little monument. I'm gonna look for it. Um, w-
Yeah, I mean, it's not tiny, but it's pretty modest. It's like it'd be easy to miss if you weren't paying. If you just drive in the parking lot and you weren't paying attention to the corner, you could miss it. But it,
I
I,
totally
I I
missed it.
kind of I wrote when I published this piece that I feel like it's sort of it just reminds you how like the fact that the monument is so modest, but the tragedy was so massive. It just kind of reminds you that there's all these things that have happened out there that we don't think about, but they still impact people today. There were 15, there were probably about a dozen families that lost people. There were other survivors who probably live with a lot of trauma from this fire, because there were 15 people who died, but there were 36 people who lived in the building. There were firefighters and cops who were there. If you look at the pictures, there were just people from the neighborhood who were like seeing all this happen. They were taking bodies out for hours. It was like a really horrific thing, and it really affected this community. If you go back and read the newspapers, it was in the papers every day for a while, and it was just really sad. And but it happened 40 years ago, so it's just sort of out of everybody's memory. Like if you don't live in that community, most people probably don't even know it happened, even though it was one of the
Right.
deadliest fires in the history of our state.
I
I mean,
mean,
I had no idea this had
yeah.
happened until a couple of
I
years
I
ago.
think I vaguely remember it because I grew up a little further north, actually. But I was actually born in Beverly, so like I don't know about it. I'm just finding out about it through you. Really, I think I vaguely remembered when it happened, like as a kid, like hearing maybe something about it. But um, it's really like James Carver's family suffered too. Like his
That too.
family
Yeah.
had to defend him with a
Yeah,
lawyer, and they
his
lost their home
brother
in Danvers, right?
yeah, his brother I've talked to, he has 3 siblings, and I talked to his younger brother, who is sort of the one who's closest to him, and he called him the 16th victim of the fire, because he's been in prison all these years for something that he says he's innocent of doing. And you're right, his uh, I can't remember the figure off the top of my head, but they spent a lot of money on a private counsel to defend him, private defense attorney, and he was still found guilty. And the family actually lost their home to foreclosure because they basically spent so much money on this lawyer. And the lawyer, this is another really sad side of the story, is that his lawyer was addicted to drugs and alcohol while representing him. And I wrote a lot about this in the story. We have extensive documentation about the lawyer's drug and alcohol addiction, because his law license was suspended as a result of it. So James Carver, just to jump back a little bit, was tried 2 times. There was a mistrial during the first trial. It's another parallel with the Karen Reed case. But in James Carver's case, the reason the mistrial happened was not because of the jury. It was because the prosecutor withheld evidence from the defense. And then it sort of came to light during the last few days of the trial, and the judge declared a mistrial. Basically, what the prosecutor withheld was there were reports from this witness, and she made contradictory statements in about the same events in 2 different interviews. And so during the second interview, when she made the contradictory statements, they provided a version of the report to the defense where they just edited those statements out so that the defense wouldn't see them and find out that this witness was
You
contradicting
break it up.
herself. Prosecutor said, "Oh, this was just a mistake," and the judge was like, "No, I literally do not believe you. Like, how could you possibly have like edited the information out of the report? Just that was not a mistake. That's clearly something that had to have been deliberate." But anyway, just to explain why there were 2 trials. But anyway, in between the 2 trials, his lawyer, a man named Dennis Jackson, got into a car accident, and he later pleaded guilty after the second James Carver trial to driving under the influence of drugs. It turned out that he was, according to his own medical records, was spending $500 a week on cocaine, and he would stay up all night. Um, he would call these things called party lines, which were, I guess, I don't know if they still exist or if it's just
Telephone
like an '80s
lines, I
thing,
know about
but
those. Yeah,
it
because
was
I
it
know a
was
guy who
yeah, it was
spent
like
his whole paycheck on that. Yeah,
you would talk to just strangers
random
and
people.
yeah, and he would stay up all night doing coke and talking to people on these things. And he would, sleep late. He wouldn't show up for work. He'd cancel meetings or reschedule them or whatever. Um, and this stuff, he was, showing up to court for James Carver, and it's not entirely clear whether he was doing cocaine while the trial was going on, but he definitely was before the trial, and that's still significant because showing up to court isn't, and even if you do a relatively good job in court, you have to like investigate the case before it happens, right? So if you are staying up all night doing coke before the trial instead of, focusing on investigating the case, that's really bad for your defendant, especially when they're facing life in prison. And the reason we know all this is because of his law license being suspended. They had what's called a hearing at the what's called the Board of Bar Overseers. So there's actually two entities. There's the Office of Bar Counsel, which is sort of like the people who I'll use the word prosecute, but it's a disciplinary thing. It's not like a criminal thing. They prosecute the attorney misconduct cases, and then the Board of Bar Overseers are kind of like the judges who decide whether to impose discipline. So I went to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court and I got the records of these proceedings. And I have his medical records and I have his own testimony. It's in transcripts and stuff, and he talks very explicitly about how he had a drug and alcohol problem. And this is all happening at the same time that he was representing James Carver. And it turned out that he was also representing other clients. He did like a poor job, or he would just not do any work for them. And then he kept the money. And, he was saying, well, it was because I was addicted to drugs and alcohol. And, so there's that angle. But then on top of it, it gets even worse because James Carver's actually tried to overturn his conviction. This is the fifth time now. And the most recent one is the only one that's kind of based on scientific evidence. Some of the other stuff deals with like legal issues and things. But in one case, he was represented by a different lawyer, and this lawyer put forth a really shocking allegation that the lawyer had Dennis Jackson had an inappropriate sexual relationship with James Carver's ex-wife while the trial, at some point while he was representing James Carver. And I should correct myself, I said ex-wife, ex now, but they were married at the time when this
Mm.
alleged sexual relationship was happening. And the person making the allegations was the ex-wife. She testified
Wow.
to this at a hearing, said basically, this guy, I wanted to get information about James Carver's case, and the lawyer invited me over to his apartment, and he would show me pornographic movies, and he, asked me to perform oral sex on him. And then after I did that, he would call me on the phone all the time, and he would like masturbate. Um, and so they brought these allegations, and a judge heard this testimony from the ex-wife, and the judge basically said, I don't think it's credible. And her reasoning was that the parents of James Carver had so this ex-wife had a kid with James Carver. She was actually born like less than 2 months before he was arrested. So he's been in prison almost her entire life. Um, and she's had to get to know him, while he's been incarcerated. But um, the judge basically said the parents have custody of the kid, and I think you're basically, BSing us because you want them to give you custody of the kid back. um, and as far as I know, there's no direct evidence of this. I actually went to the court and got the family court records, and I have not seen any evidence that they didn't give the kid back after this hearing happened. In fact, by the time the judge had written her opinion, they had already had this hearing before family court, and the parents didn't say we want to give the kid back. So there's no evidence that that's actually true, but that's what the judge said. There was also based partly on the ex-wife was having difficulty remembering like the dates when some of this stuff happened, and getting some of the details mixed up and stuff. But that's not necessarily showing that she's lying, because this she's testifying like 10 years after this happened, so it's to be expected that she might get some details wrong or have trouble remembering some stuff. I don't know whether it's true or not, but what is interesting is that there is extensive evidence that the lawyer was actually harassing lots of other women at the time when all this was going on. And actually, I shouldn't say women, I should say teen girls for the most part.
Mm.
He would call them on the phone and use an alias. He had, I want to say it was like Paul Kelly or something was one of the ones he used. He would call teen girls and he would say, "Hey, I'm an amateur photographer. I heard you might be interested in modeling, and I'd like to take some pictures and complete my portfolio." And I'm talking like 16, 17-year-old girls. And this is something that actually came up at his board of bar overseers disciplinary hearing. There were two girls who provided depositions, and one of them said he invited her back to his apartment, and she didn't say that he made any explicitly sexual comments, but she said that once they got back to his apartment, he was kind of dropped the stuff about being a photographer. It was mostly just saying, "Hey, we should go on a date sometime. Do you want to hang out with me?" Blah blah blah. And she was kind of creeped out and left. This other girl who was deposed said that he made explicitly sexual comments. Was asking whether she liked to have oral sex. Was asking she said allegedly that if she didn't enjoy sex, it was because she hadn't had sex with an older, more experienced man before. Really creepy stuff. And there were like 5 teen girls at least who talked to police about this at the time. This is around the time when he got into the drugged driving accident, so also overlaps with the time he's representing James Carver. And
Imagine
um,
this is your lawyer. I
yeah,
mean,
no,
just
it's
imagine this is
crazy.
your lawyer.
But so one of the other girls, she wasn't deposed, but there is a police report. She was the younger sister of a friend of James Carver's who was a defense witness. So imagine that your lawyer talks to like your buddy who's going to testify, help provide your alibi or whatever, and then afterwards he calls up that guy's younger sister on the phone and is being a creep. Like, would you want that person as your lawyer? Like,
I
and
wouldn't
like
want that person
it's
doing
great.
anything to me. I wouldn't
No,
want
I
that
know.
person, like, cleaning my house. Like, you know
And
what I
then
mean? Like,
and then it doesn't even end there, because he's later, this stuff was not criminally prosecuted, but he was charged several years later. Actually, he was charged shortly before the hearing of when the ex-wife testified. He was charged with calling lots of other girls, and in some cases adult women, and doing the same routine about I'm a photographer and can I take pictures of you. And he you know he told the police that he allegedly that he did this kind of thing when he drank too much and stuff. So this is, you wouldn't want this guy representing you if you had a parking ticket, let alone if you're facing life in prison for murder. And I don't want to like belittle anyone who is struggling with drugs and alcohol addiction. um that's not why I'm talking about this, to make him like look bad. It's because it, it's important. It's part of the story. And if someone again is in prison for life and they were represented by someone like this, that's important and people should hear about it. It's the same as if the guy who just operated on you, and screwed up, had just stayed up all night doing coke the night before he did surgery on you or something. It's the same situation. If you've got a life in your hands, you have a huge moral responsibility to not engage in this kind of behavior, to
yeah.
and if you are struggling with drug and alcohol addiction and you're in this, if you have these responsibilities, you need to do the right thing and kind of put your ego and put your sort of career aside and say, I need to do the right thing, and somebody else has got to take over. I can't be doing this while I'm trying to get sober and stop staying up all night doing drugs and alcohol. You shouldn't be representing people who are facing life in prison, and it adds to the whole injustice of the thing, where if, let alone all the stuff about the police, the prosecutor, the bad junk science, forensic stuff, just your own lawyer. If you can't trust your own lawyer, then it just compounds everything else that's going on in the case.
Now, I just want to ask the audience if the sound's okay tonight, because we've been having some StreamYard issues. I did notice you're breaking up a little bit, but it seems like it's okay. I just want to make sure for the
Okay.
chat, because I missed it last time and they all got mad at me. Like I
Okay.
wasn't
Let me
paying
let me know
attention.
if I'm cutting out. I can,
Yeah, that's all. I'm asking the audience. They'll let us know. I haven't seen anything. I think we sound good. I just want to make sure, because I've been noticing this. I don't know. StreamYard works so well, and then a big company buys it, and all of a sudden, the last 3 shows we've had all these noise, sound issues. It just always happens that way when the big company purchases the little company. I noticed that on my podcasting app too. When Spotify bought it, quality went to shit.
Mhm.
But they're saying we sound good. Okay, good.
Okay,
No,
good.
no crackling. That's the big thing. The last time it was crackling last show, and it just sucks when you have great content, but you can't really hear it because of the crackling. But that's it. We're good tonight. Thank you so
Uh-huh.
much for everyone who's watching. Let us in. Let us know.
Yeah, definitely. If there's I don't have the chat open. If anybody's got like questions or comments,
Yeah, I'll
definitely
relay them
chime
back
in.
to you.
I saw a couple people on Twitter were saying, tweeting me saying they knew stuff about the fire. They had heard about it before. So uh, yeah, definitely. I had the private chat open, so I wasn't seeing the public comments, but I'm looking at some of them now.
Cool.
But if anybody's
Just
got
don't.
comments,
If you do
post them
one
now.
thing,
Yeah,
I just want to make sure you don't answer questions without reading them. Like, because
yeah,
that's
definitely,
like
of course.
annoying as f. I see other shows do that. It's like the rest. Everyone else doesn't know what you're answering. They
No, I
say,
know.
"Yeah." I just want to make sure. Now this happened in Beverly, Massachusetts. What happened with this attorney? What is this attorney still around? Is he talking about
He
this case?
he died a number of years ago, but his law license was actually only suspended for, I believe, 3 years, but it was he would have had to, I believe, shown that he was, like sort of in good standing and had his issues sorted out before they would have given him his license back. But the information I have is that he never got his license back, and I assume it's because he kept getting into trouble. He had, I mentioned that he was arrested for creeping on, teen girls and stuff and making these harassing phone calls. He was also arrested for more DUIs in the years after the trial. Um, and so as far as I know, he just sort of never got his act together after this. Um, but he's James Carver is now represented by 2 other lawyers who uh, should shout them out. Lisa Kavanaugh is the director of the Innocence Program at the Committee for Public Counsel Services, which is what they call the Massachusetts Public Defender's Office. So she's someone who's sort of dedicated her career to representing people who have innocence claims. And he also has a second attorney, Charlotte Whitmore. She's a staff attorney at the Boston College Innocence Program. So another attorney who is, her whole career at this point is focused on representing people who say that they're innocent of the crimes they were convicted of. And this has been so that his current motion for a new trial has been kind of a long time coming. They've been representing him since 2019, and they filed the motion for a new trial in like March 2022, I believe is the date. And then it was about almost 2 years before they got this hearing before the judge. So, and then of course James Carver has been, waiting for like 3 decades to get information like this into court. And for, it's it can take a long time. It's, I think, one of the unfortunate things about the way the system works is everything in the law. So the law and science are kind of like opposites in a way, because if in the law, if you say this is the way we've always done things before, that's accepted, right? Like they call it precedent, right? So if something's precedent, then that's how you do it. And as opposed to in science, well, if we did a study and proved that it's wrong, we can just throw out whatever everybody has always believed because we found out that it's wrong. But because of the way that the law works, everything is based on we have precedents, and then once we've sort of figured something out, it's final. We don't really want to go back unless there's a really, really good reason. And that's kind of it's so hard to get information or to get a new trial because they can't you can't just go in and say, look, there was some shady stuff going on in my trial. They'll say, yeah, but you already talked about all that at your trial. You talked about how um, the prosecutor was able to withhold these police reports, and they already declared a mistrial, and et cetera, et cetera. Whereas you need to actually have evidence that it's considered like newly discovered, which means that it wasn't available at the time of the original trial, which is why like which is why it's so problematic that you can allow information in, like saying that, well, we can just look at these char marks on the wall and that proves that they had to have had a flammable liquid poured on the newspapers, when there's no science backing that up. Like you should do I think a big problem with our system is that we it doesn't judges aren't scientists, right? They don't go to school and get engineering degrees or scientific degrees. They don't work in laboratories. They go to law school and they learn how lawyers argue, and they learn about precedent and stuff like that. And it's hard for judges to evaluate science, and so they let in stuff. It becomes part of precedent, and then uh, you have to like get science to prove something and after the fact to get yourself out of prison, rather than them having to basically have the science nailed down before they use this supposed science to put you away. And I think that's kind of backwards. It's and this stuff about like junk science for fires is it's not just one case. This is something, these myths about fire, about like supposed alligator charring, and there were other myths that were in other cases. um, these have affected sort of an unknown number of cases, because I've talked about this before. The In Massachusetts, we've had the drug lab scandal, we had the second drug lab scandal, we had the breathalyzer scandal where the state police weren't calibrating the machines correctly and they were hiding the information from people. We just had the thing where they were secretly recording people, it
Yeah.
was illegal, and then they were hiding the evidence of the recordings from people. We have all these systemic things. And what happens when you have, at least in recent years, our courts in Massachusetts, when they have sort of a systemic thing that can be linked to sort of one person, like one Annie Dukin or one Sonia Farrick or one sort of entity like the Office of Alcohol Testing in the state police, or these state troopers.
Yeah. It's just Michael Proctor. It's just one guy. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
if you
like,
have
yeah,
one guy, you can say, okay, well, we
one
can
half tall guy.
overturn a bunch of cases because we know that it's all about this one thing. But if you have an idea, like an idea that, well, these burn marks prove arson, it's really hard to uh, just sort of open up all those cases again. And more importantly, not only is it hard, but nobody's even trying to do it. What happens is a guy like James Carver is lucky enough to get on the radar of these like innocence lawyers, and they spend years putting together a case, and maybe he gets out of prison, and then they move on to the next client and they hope that they can get somebody else out of prison. And we don't even know how many people are in prison who were put away with this kind of evidence. And there's another guy, Victor Rosario, who he was also represented by Lisa Kavanaugh, who was convicted of an arson that killed, alleged arson that killed multiple people, and it was all based on junk
Mm.
science. And he got out of prison a number of years ago. And like last year, I want to say he got like a $13 million civil rights settlement from, I think it's Lowell. I want to say Lowell. Maybe it was Lynn. So sorry, it was one of the L cities, but he got like a $13 million settlement. And but it's not just two cases. It's not just James Carver and Victor Rosario. We don't know how many of these cases. I have the names of other people who were exonerated from arson cases in Massachusetts, and I haven't even
I think this is a common problem. People
had
keep bringing it up
time
tonight.
to look into all these other cases because it's a lot of work to look into one of these cases.
Yeah, people keep
What's
bringing
up?
up in the chat about Trooper Paul with the Karen Reach trial because he was a guy that they brought out as an expert that only had an associate's degree, and he just made, like, huge leaps, like conclusions that just and then you had the 2 PhD guys come from the defense, and it was just such a dichotomy of, like, expert versus, like, who is this guy from the Mass State Police? Like, it's just funny how they bring out these people as experts, but they're actually not experts. They
Yeah, I mean they'll try to put they just come up with a name for something, and now anybody who takes a course is an expert or whatever. Like they've had this whole thing in Massachusetts, which the courts have actually rejected, thankfully, about I know you know about this, Mike, but the drug recognition
oh,
experts,
yeah.
where they're like,
DREs.
oh well, I took a 2-week training course, and now I can tell whether or not people are high or whatever, and it's all junk. There's no science backing any of it up, but they need to find ways to put people away. And if they can convince some people by saying I'm an expert and I have, and they'll go through all their training and try to make it sound like they are an expert, and that we should take their opinion seriously, when in reality they're basically just making a guess. They're making, it might be an educated guess, they might actually have a little bit of training that that helps them, but at the end of the day it's still just some guy giving an opinion, right? And that's what happened in the James Carver case. Is the guy who testified against him as the expert witness was just like a firefighter who, you know, he was actually asked. They do voir dire, which is when they decide whether or not the person is an expert. Outside the presence of the jury, they'll ask the person about their qualifications and stuff. He was asked, like, do you have a scientific degree? And he said he had a high school diploma, and he like started college but didn't finish it, and he had no advanced degrees in any scientific field. And his credentials were basically, well, I've gotten a bunch of training about how to investigate fires, which the training, of course, is by other people who also probably only have high school degrees and have no scientific background. And this field of arson investigation was not like formalized at the time. Like I showed you this manual. This is something that came about, in the years after this case, and it's based on work of like scientists and engineers who have like looked at myths about fire, and they've tried to sort of create actual standards for investigating fire that maybe aren't perfect, but they're based on science and they're based on the best available information. Whereas a lot of what they used to do is they just like they would use what they thought was common sense. Like another uh, idea that came up in the James Carver case, the reason they decided initially that the fire started on these newspapers outside the building on ground level was because they had this idea that fire can't spread downward, it only spreads upward. And there's like a certain logic to that, because like heat rises and smoke rises, and if you hold a match, like the fire will burn upward. But like flames can still spread downward. It was just like an urban legend that people thought made sense, but like if you actually even thought about it that hard, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And the Craig Byler, the expert fire safety engineer who testified for James Carver at this recent hearing, his theory is like one of the ways fire can spread downward is what's called a drop down fire. So basically, imagine the ceiling is on fire. A chunk of that flaming ceiling can fall down
Embers, yeah.
onto the first floor, and even if the first floor is not on fire, that flaming debris can set the
Right.
floor on fire. So just because this alcove at ground level is on fire doesn't mean that the fire started there and spread upward. It could have started above, and then debris
Yeah,
fell
what
down.
comes up must come down is a thing of for physics. I mean, that makes so much sense. Like, I look at the wildfires out in California, so many
Mhm.
times you see a roof or, like, a tree on fire, and like you said, the embers start falling down onto the next house,
Yeah.
and that's what you see, like, next thing you know, their roof's on fire, or their patio, or their deck, or whatever it is that's below, because the embers start falling down. It's true.
Mhm.
So, it can go up or down, yeah.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
And that wasn't something that was even considered at all at the time in the 1980s, that maybe the fire started somewhere else and it just spread downward. They just said, well, fire, spreads up, so it must have started at ground level since that's where the lowest point of burning was. But it's just not true, And at this hearing, I think what the most interesting thing to me, or maybe not interesting, but the most striking thing to me was in the opening statement and the closing arguments, the way the difference in the two sides. So the Essex County DA's office, who thinks James Carver shouldn't get a new trial, they started their opening statement by saying basically that this was a really old case and that James Carver should have brought these issues to court sooner. Essentially blaming this guy who's in prison for like not getting scientific evidence to court, that they should have had before they even prosecuted him. And they sort of closed their argument on like a similar note, which was sort of like technicalities, basically saying, well, some of this stuff is new, some of it is just sort of like an opinion, and it's not really new science, it's just like an opinion about the evidence. And so the judge shouldn't even look at the new testimony. He should just ignore it because it's not really, newly discovered evidence. So basically saying that whether this guy is guilty or not, uh, we should just keep him in prison because it's been a really long time and because we don't want the judge to look at the evidence. Um, just like just sweep it under the rug. No big deal. It's not like anything's at stake here. It's just a guy who's been in prison, for decades. Um, whereas James Carver's lawyers were his lawyer, Lisa Kavanaugh, who did the opening or who did the closing argument. She was focused on justice. Um, she opened her closing, or I'm sorry, I think earlier I said that the DA's office opened their opening statement. I meant they opened their closing argument and ended their closing argument. But the Lisa Kavanaugh, she opened her closing argument by saying that, you know, if we have evidence that the jury didn't see, the jury should see it. Our system is based on jury trials. It's not based on like, you know, uh, the the DA's office deciding that he's still guilty, even though parts of their case are falling apart. It's not them like, well, we think he's still guilty, so he shouldn't get a new trial. It's if you have important evidence, a jury should hear it. And Lisa Kavanaugh ended her closing argument by talking about, justice, doing what's right, and that is such a striking difference. One side basically saying, well, we think that you shouldn't even look at the evidence because of legal technicalities or whatever. And the other side saying, we care about justice and we care about the jury seeing all the evidence. That's such a major difference. And it was like really striking to hear. And when I read the transcript again, just striking again, just it, it I don't want to like psychoanalyze the DA's office, but like it just I don't get it. Like how someone can make those arguments, like I if I had to guess, I think it's just that like it's like lawyer brain where, well, I'm defending a client and this is the client's position, and the DA's office wants this guy in prison, so I'm just going to do what I can and the other side will do what they can and then we'll see what happens, kind of thing. And I think it's also like not wanting to admit that the
You're
office might have
wrong.
made a mistake.
Yeah. And I
It's
think
like,
it's like we had someone in the chat tonight who was saying that they were friends with a family member of someone who died in the fire.
mhm.
And so like they think that James is guilty. So I think there's a lot of that too, where the DA's office has people that they still, all those people, all those family members, they think that James did it. A lot of them, I'm sure. I'm sure they've
Yeah.
bought this case. So for them, now they got to explain, like, why are we turning our back and saying James didn't do it now after you told us for 30 years he did it?
Yeah, I
So I
mean,
think some of that might come into play.
that's something I've thought about a lot. And I actually, I've spoken with some people who either had family members who died in the fire. I actually spoke to a guy who survived the fire. Some of them moved on with their life and never really paid much attention to this, but I did speak with a woman who was related to I said there were three
The three
people of the
family
same
members.
family who died. She was the sibling of these two brothers and the granddaughter of the grandmother. So she had three people who died in this fire, and she believes James Carver is guilty. And it it's I have to say that this is one of like the hardest things about writing about this, because I feel like tremendous empathy for these people, and it's not. I don't want to like diminish their pain in any way,
Mhm.
even if I sort of don't necessarily agree with them. Um, but and I also think that their feelings and their thoughts are part of the story, whether they end up being true or not. Because this is a tragedy that affected people's lives, and that's important. But at the end of the day, justice is not about people's emotions. It's about the truth, and doing what's right. And I and I also, you're right. Like, to tell people this is your family member was murdered when maybe it was like an electrical fire, or it was some kind of accident, and then they live their entire life with that pain of thinking someone killed people that I loved, when I'm not saying they would not feel pain if it was an accident, because obviously you're still good, but it's different, and people deserve the truth as well, and they don't shouldn't live with something that's not true. And that's just one of the reasons why, whether the person's guilty or not, it's so important for these investigations to be credible. And when they're based on forensics, it should be based on science, not just some guy who says he has
Yeah,
a
what
lot of
I think.
training.
Yeah,
uh, and they owe it to the family members and to the victims, and um, they owe it to people to just get it right. And it's a struggle just to sort of like think about this, because I feel for people who, they might think he's guilty, but their pain is real, and you can't like ignore that.
like the Karen Reed case, like the brother doesn't, we feel that a lot of us feel the same way. It's like it's tough. It's a tough situation when there are real victims and it's not so clear what actually happened. Let's talk about this other part of this. James Carver in 1984. This happened.
Can I just respond to a
Oh
comment
yeah,
really quick?
yeah. Go ahead.
Someone said sad. Sad. I'm sure there is some sort of comfort in thinking someone is paying for their family's deaths. And I just want to say, when I talked to this woman, um, I believe her name was. I just want to get her name right. I think it was Julie Nickerson Benedict's. Um, she was not happy. She's feels horrible all these years later, and she had so much anger towards James Carver. And I'm not trying to tell her how to feel or anything. I'm just saying I don't think that this made her happy. And I I I don't know that there is any comfort in the justice system and holding people, putting people in jail. Maybe there can be for some people, but I think, like, I just don't know that that's true. The idea that like people are happy when
Yeah, that you don't get
someone is
your
punished.
relative, you don't get your son back, you don't get
No,
your child back. I mean, that's
no,
the bottom line.
no. I think that, and that just goes back to my point before about we need to have preventative prevention, because like even if this fire was an arson, if you had better safety measures in this building, maybe the building would have caught fire, but it wouldn't have spread, and the fire department would have gotten there in time to put it out, and nobody would have died, or the death count may have at least been a lot smaller. This fire spread. The problems with the building were such that the by the time anyone noticed it, there was a cop down the street, and by the time he noticed it and got there, the whole like the second and third stories were on fire, and there were, I believe, 6 people were found dead in their beds. That's how fast this fire spread through the building.
Never
Like they
even get
had
up.
they had no chance. They're just the building. It just went. There was a the fire chief, after the day after the fire, he said that the building it's this old wood frame building. I mentioned there are no fire stops, no sprinklers. There's an open staircase where fire can just, shoot up the staircase. He said it was built to burn. And you should
Did
never
they
be
did
you
the
should never be
people
saying that the day
yeah,
after a fire that this
did the
building was
people that
built
own
to
the
burn.
building get held to any responsibility for this?
They were sued, and they I believe I want to say that it was like a sort of a bankruptcy thing where they basically paid out all the money they had left over, and it was, like a paltry amount for the for the victims. Some of them got only like a few $1,000s. The guy I mentioned I talked to, um, he jumped out of the second story, and he um, he landed right on his feet, and he hurt his legs. He couldn't walk for a while. He had to go to a hospital for several months, and then he was in a wheelchair. Or I'm sorry, I think he was maybe in the hospital for like a month or two, and then he was in a wheelchair for several months. And he got like a few $1,000s out of this lawsuit. Like it wasn't, and he told me he still has pain. And he can walk now, but he has pain, and it can be difficult sometimes. And the amount of money he got for it, he deserved more, but it was such that it was like it. I said bankruptcy. It might have been like an insurance payout. Actually, I apologize if I got that wrong. You're this stuff wasn't in the story. I have read up on this, so I apologize if I got the detail wrong. But I know I have the documents. It was there was a lawsuit that led to like a payout, and it was kind of spread among several victims, and it was a paltry amount,
It
after it
seems
was
like they're
divided
the
up.
ones that should have been in jail. Like, from everything you're saying here, like, that it looks like an electrical fire. I mean, if anyone should have been in jail, not James Carver. But let's talk about the biggest piece of evidence against James Carver, the thing that they're using. I think the DA is there was a confession. There was an alleged confession to a woman. Can you tell us
Oh
about
yeah,
what happened there?
yeah. This is an important point because I want to be clear that like there is other evidence. It's not just like they picked James Carver as like a scapegoat. I mean, it might be, but there's some evidence that he. So the alleged motive of the prosecution came up with is that family that lost three people. The older son, he was like a 20 or 21-year old. His name was Rick Nickerson, and he had gone on a couple of dates with this young woman who was James Carver's ex fiance. She had broken up with James Carver. She went on a couple of dates with this guy, and the night before the fire, and the fire happened at like 4 in the morning. So we're talking like less than 12 hours before this fire. James Carver, according to like multiple witnesses, he allegedly threatened this guy. Um, and what he actually said is sort of up for debate because there are different witnesses who made different accounts, and they came forward with the information at different times. So it's not entirely clear uh, whether it was like a how serious the threat was. But there's that aspect. But then they didn't charge James Carver based on this, but it was one of the things that sort of put him on the radar of the police. Um, but what ultimately led to them charging James Carver is that a former friend of Carver, she had moved to New York, um, and she is called up by the police in 1987, so like a couple years after the fire, or actually maybe 3 years after the fire. Um, and they talked to her. They said they've gotten information, and she tells them for the first time that James Carver confessed to her that he set the fire. And when she testifies to this in court, and she says that basically in like October 1984, so a few months after the fire, and remember October 1984 is like a couple years before she talks to the police. And I should also point out that she talked to the police before October 1984 because she was like an associate of James Carver. They had spoken to her. So she had been in contact with the police, knew how to get in contact with them and with the detectives and everything, but she didn't go forward to the police. They got some information from someone else, then they go to her, and then she tells them, a few years after the fact, James Carver confessed to me in 1984. She has this story that she testifies to that Carver basically calls her on the phone, says, I don't want to talk on the phone, come in person. She goes to his house, and then he's, crying, and he says, and he's been drinking, and he's really emotional. He says he like wants to kill himself, and he says that um, basically he basically confesses to the whole prosecution's theory of the case, according to her. I poured the gasoline on the phone books. I set it on fire. I did it because I wanted to get at this guy um, who had dated my ex fiance. And he says, although he says he just wanted to scare them, he wasn't trying to kill anybody. And you know this his lawyer sort of his lawyer made a closing argument, and I want to be clear, this is a lawyer's argument. We shouldn't necessarily say this is what James Carver actually said. This could be just legal strategy. He said that basically James Carver did in fact say this stuff, but that it was because he was sort of crying out for help, I believe was the lawyer's words. And the context of this is James Carver's like a 21-year-old kid. He's been under investigation by the police for months. They've been like tailing him. They've been talking to every single person he knows, his family, his friends, people he works with. And, all these people think that he set the fire because the police have been telling that, or have been, making it clear that he's a suspect. Everybody thinks he did it. And he was sort of just like, gave up hope and was kind of like, whatever, I'm just going to say I did it. Um, and I don't know that that's a great argument, confessing that, or saying that your guy confessed to it, even if you have kind of an explanation to say that, well, he didn't really mean it, isn't a promising argument, in my opinion. But James Carver's current lawyers, they have an argument now, which is this um, basically they haven't sort of committed to a particular theory yet. They have one idea, maybe that this witness who said the confession happened was lying, and the other is um, that he did confess, kind of like the lawyer said during his argument at trial, but that it was a false confession. But their point is that all that new fire science we talked about uh, they basically said their expert Craig Byler, this fire safety engineer, his explanation of how the fire happened completely contradicts what James Carver allegedly confessed to. So James Carver allegedly said, just like the prosecution's theory, well, I set it on fire by pouring gasoline on some newspapers and setting them on fire. Uh, of course, on the ground, right? But the expert said, well, the fire couldn't have happened on the ground because it's literally physically impossible there's no evidence that gasoline was used, first of all, and it's also physically impossible for the fire to have spread from those newspapers to the walls. And also the damage, like I said, to the ceiling was more extensive, so it must have started somewhere in the ceiling, not on the ground level. So if you put that information before a jury might say, well, maybe this witness was lying. Maybe she just didn't like James Carver. Maybe she, and I should say for context, the police or the officials said like a day after the fire, we think it was arson, and we believe what happened was somebody set a bundle of newspapers on fire in this alcove with the doorway. So, and I'm sure that they were in their interviews with witnesses may have asked questions to that effect, or they may have even straight up just told people this is our theory. Um, so the there's for someone to have invented a confession would have been trivial. They already had, and then when the cops come to them, the cops could just ask them leading questions and say, well, did he confess to using newspapers? Did he confess to using gasoline? They can just, so it's very troubling that this confession emerged years after the fact rather than shortly
Yeah,
after it supposedly
if
happened.
that really happened, why wouldn't she go to the police right away? That would be my first thing. Like,
Right. Well,
are you
she
kidding
had
me? This is like a huge deal. 15 people died
yeah, I mean,
and
she
you didn't
said
tell anyone?
she said she was scared, and I mean, I think
No, come on.
there's also maybe, like, if she was friends with him at the time, maybe you wanna
Yeah.
protect your friend and you're not sure what to do. I
I
mean,
just
there are explanations for it, but it's troubling, right? Like,
It
it's
is.
hard
And you
to
know what?
piece
Like
this
the other thing
together.
too, like the false confession thing. You look into it, especially Innocence Project. So many people have been freed from jail that were totally innocent
Mhm.
and they confessed. And the reason
Yeah,
why is
yeah,
people get pressured. Like it reminds me of when I was a kid. I'm gonna tell a story about a kid I knew who got picked on every day. And he was a heterosexual young man. And it doesn't even matter what his sexuality is. But you know how cruel kids can be about things like that? They used to call him
mhm,
the F word, like saying that he was a gay kid.
right.
And after a while, he pretended he was gay, even though he wasn't, because they used to call him that. And he'd go by that. That's the way false confessions work. Like you have the whole world saying you're something. You did this, you did this, you did this for months. And this guy is going on for years.
Yeah, well, I mean, this
Some
supposed
people
confession
crack
was
and say, "I'm
months,
just gonna
but
admit it even though I didn't do it because everyone thinks I did it, so I might as well just be that." It's kinda
yeah,
like yeah, I mean, it happens a lot.
sure, and it is possible, like, if he wants, like, if everybody thinks he did it, he might have said, "Okay, well, I did it, but I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I was just trying to scare people," because he wants sympathy. He doesn't want people to think he's this monster. He if everybody believes you did it, then it can seem like the best course of action is to roll with it and say, "Yeah, I did it, but I'm going to put it in context and make it seem like I'm not as bad as you think I am." And it's possible, but so maybe that did happen, but at the same time, maybe this confession was just made up, and it's hard to say. But when you have scientific evidence that kind of conflicts with the confession,
That's
something
yeah.
is going on there.
The science is what I go with. I don't go over
Yeah,
confessions because confessions are not like, you can't count on them. You cannot count on a confession. It's just facts. It's like
right.
you have this human thing
Yeah,
going on that
it's
we can't count on it. Can't.
yeah, I
So,
believe it's there's been a lot of studies about false confessions since, like, 1989 is when sort of DNA kind of was used to start exonerating people, and we've learned more about false confessions since then because we have so many cases where people falsely confess, and people believe the confession, but then years later it's like, oh, DNA evidence proves that somebody else did it, so that the confession had to have been false. There's no question about it. And out of the people who've been exonerated, it's like, I don't know the exact number, but it's, many people
hmm.
have been falsely
And
confessed, and then
even
DNA
yeah,
shows
and
that they're
even
innocent.
even cops know about the false confessions. Because 'cause I'll give you an example, like, some of the cops I've talked to in the past will talk about, like, when they put up tip lines, when they ask for tips on crimes. Well,
Hmm.
a lot of times they get these crank callers who confess to the crime, even though and the cops have to figure out, is this person a crank confessing to something they didn't do? That's, like, very common. Like, cops have to actually figure out, is this person a crazy person confessing to something they didn't do? Which happens more than you think. It's like people do it for like they want to be notorious. They want to be the one. They want to be like
Hmm.
if you put out some, tip line for the Zodiac killer, 6 people will call up because they want to be the ones that are on TV. Like they're that crazy. People are so it happens. It does happen a lot.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of them, the ones that are most well studied are ones that happen in the context of, like, a police interrogation, because we
Yeah.
know that, cops will do, like, the good cop, bad cop routine or things like that.
The
They'll pressure
pressure.
people,
The
but
pressure.
it can still happen if it's a friend or family member. People will sometimes get falsely accused of something by their boss, and they'll, falsely
Exactly.
confess to it. It can happen. Like,
I see if people do it at work. People will
mhm,
take the fall for somebody else, or they'll just be like, you know what? Let's just get it over with. Because if I don't admit to this to the boss, he's gonna keep harping on me until I just say I did it, even though I didn't do it. Like I've seen that happen too. Like there's so many reasons why people do false confessions. Let's be serious. And having pressure, have it sitting in a room with the police on you, for hours. That's usually where it happens. But in this case, I can see in a small town like Danvers. I know Danvers. My family grew up in Danvers, and it happened in Beverly. 15 people died.
mhm.
Everyone that he ran into is looking at this guy and saying, "Wow, you did it. You did it. You did it." He knows it. Everyone. in these small towns, word travels quickly. They all talk, and I can just imagine the kid sitting there saying, "Shit, I'll just tell people I didn't mean to do it, even though I didn't do it, just so they understand and leave me alone a little bit." I could totally see him do it, especially when he's drunk. Like, so I don't buy the confession. I really don't. I have trouble with confessions.
Yeah,
I go with science. I
yeah,
want
and
to
I
see
mean,
what the actual proof
yeah,
says.
just again, yeah, you've got to, and again, you got to keep this supposed confession in context. Which again, this guy is literally like under surveillance by the police. You know, he like worked for a taxi place, and there would be cops following him around. There'd be cops parked outside his house. Like literally, I have all the police reports. Like every person this guy knew is being interviewed by the police, and I'm sure they're all being said, "Hey, we want to talk to you about James Carver," you know, and they're asking questions about the
That
fire
gets
and stuff.
around very
Like
quickly in a
everybody
town.
thinks,
Yeah,
yeah,
at a town
like
like Danvers, and
yeah,
I
and
know
and people were
Danvers.
even
My family was
people
all
this
there.
people were even
Everything
asked
gets
about
around that
this.
town.
People were asked about
Yeah,
this at the trial. Like,
word travels very
did you
fast.
think he was a suspect? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm telling you, the gossip in Danvers, especially. I mean, I can't tell you how quickly things travel around that town. So, but just let's, you know, have you talked to James Carver? Have you had an opportunity, or the attorneys probably aren't letting you talk to him? Have you talked to him at all?
He said hi to me in court, but that's about the as close as I've gotten to him. His attorneys, you know, don't want him to say anything that's going to get him in trouble or anything. So I they I mean, they talk to me a little bit, but it's mostly just to like share information. It's not to like talk to me, you know, interviews and, you know, let me ask questions and stuff. So I I haven't talked to James Carver. I would, you know, like to someday, before or after he gets out of prison. And I have talked to his brother though, and I've sort of gotten secondhand some of his thoughts through his brother. And his brother, you know, I mentioned this hearing, which, just to clarify, what's going on is the judge. His name is Judge Jeffrey Karp. He's in Essex County Superior Court. He had like a 5-day hearing where they presented all this new expert testimony and evidence and stuff, and he's ruling on the motion for a new trial. And he's going to look at all this evidence. He's going to decide whether they've sort of met their legal burden for a new trial. And we don't know when the ruling's coming out. It could be, you know, 2 months from now. It could be a year from now. Um, Thanks to the person who said they love my last name. um,
Cormier.
yeah, but so we don't know when this ruling is coming out. But his James Carver's brother Bill talked to me after the hearing, and he basically said, you know, he is both, you know, excited and like dreading this. He's excited for and dreading this ruling because we just don't know how it's going to go. You know,
Could be it.
this judge is hard to read. Like he's made some comments. Like he mentioned that the DA's office conceding that there's no evidence that like gasoline was used to start the fire. He said, you know, that's really significant. But on the other hand, you know, he's asked some pretty tough questions of James Carver's lawyers. He was asking a lot of questions of all the experts at the hearing. You know, it's mostly the lawyers who ask the question, but these things are, you know, the judges will jump in a lot and ask their own questions too. It was clear he's trying to like wrap his head around this whole thing, but and it's clear in certain cases that he was less inclined to go with certain arguments versus other ones. But his like ultimate disposition in terms of whether he's going to give James Carver a new trial is like I really have no idea. Like I'm not, I you know, don't ask me to predict it because I won't. I have no idea. And I can totally understand, you know, that feeling that like I finally, after 30, you know, 5 years, have this opportunity to get out of prison, but you know, this could also be my last chance, and it might not pan out. You know, I might not get out of prison. I don't know what this judge is going to do, and you know, I'm I'm anticipating that decision too. I've been, you know, investing a lot of time in this over the last couple of years, and I really want to know what the outcome is going to be. But I'm in the, you know, playing the waiting game too. I've got to wait for this and just see how it goes.
What's your gut? What do you think? You think they'll give him a new trial?
I mean, I just told you, Mike. I don't want to make a prediction. I mean, my personal opinion, this is what I'll give you, is that I believe he deserves a new trial. You know, I don't want to say whether he's innocent or not, because I wasn't there. I truthfully, I don't know. I I am more con what I am convinced of is that his trial wasn't fair because he didn't have the opportunity to present, you know, this scientific evidence, because the science wasn't developed at the time. It's new information. He didn't get a fair trial because the DA's office was allowed to present stuff that just wasn't scientific at all. And um, his, I mentioned his attorney was compromised in a number of ways, which, even if the attorney did a great job, the mere fact that he has a legitimate basis to question, you know, whether the attorney was, going behind his back and, creeping on his wife, and, was, staying up all night doing coke and etc. Um, it, there's so many issues with this case, and that combined with the stuff that we already knew about back during the trial, like the fact that the prosecutor withheld evidence, um, and 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 many other stuff. I talk. I don't think we have time to get into this, but all the problems with the eyewitness testimony that supposedly placed James Carver at the scene of this fire, but just as I'll let people read the story on this one, but it's just clearly not reliable at all. And they should have, if it happened now, they probably would have been allowed to present scientific evidence of a psychologist who can explain the science of eyewitness testimony and eyewitness identification, and how eyewitnesses, when they're viewing strangers, can make mistakes very easily, even if they're trying to get it right. There are just so many problems with this case that there's no way anybody could look at all the evidence, in my opinion, and confidently say this guy is guilty. And if you can't do that, you've got to at least give the guy a new trial and let a jury decide again. Even if a jury were to find him guilty again, he at least deserves,
That
the due process of having a new trial, because ultimately, the system should be based on fairness. And if they can
you broke up
present junk science, and then when the real science comes out, you're not allowed to present that. And, that's just, and I broke up.
for a second. Yeah.
Do you say my audio
Let's
broke out? Oh,
I
sorry. I'm
think
just
your
saying,
video
if
too.
if they can present, oh, am I good yet?
Yeah, you good.
Okay, breaking up when I'm making the take home point. Just, if they can present a bunch of junk science at your trial, and then when the real science comes out, you can't present that to the jury, that's just fundamentally unfair, right? Like, you should get a trial that's based on the real evidence, not a bunch of junk. And one other point, which is, they might not be able to try him again if this is overturned, because some of the witnesses are dead. Some of them, and every witness who's still alive, their memory is going to have faded. This happened like 40 years ago, um, like more than 40 years ago now. Um, has Andrew watched Trial 4? Yes. That's the Sean Ellis documentary.
Great.
But anyway, back to my point. Sorry, that was a comment in the chat, about a documentary on Netflix that people should watch, Trial 4, about another wrongful conviction.
Sean Ellis. That was a
Yeah,
good
Sean Ellis,
documentary.
um, who I've seen speak many times and is a very powerful speaker. In person, I've seen him. But watch the documentary if you haven't. Um, but they might not be able to try James Carver today, just because of, fading memories, because people have died. Um, that doesn't matter though. Like, what matters is whether the trial that's already happened was fair, and you should not, like, hold someone in prison because, well, we don't have the evidence to put him away now. Like, if the science, like, just because, even if they believe that they could try that, if they believe that they could have tried him back in the day if they had the modern science and still convicted him, that doesn't change the fact that the trial was unfair, right? Like, the trial verdict should still be overturned, because he deserves a fair trial. And if you can't give him a fair trial, that's not his fault, right? Like, innocent people, and I'm not saying he's innocent, but people can be innocent, possibly him. They shouldn't stay in prison because, well, now we can't convict you, like, they should only be I mean, I don't even. I'm kind of on the like prison abolitionist wavelength. I don't know exactly how we'll get there, but fundamentally, even if you believe in the system of like we should put people in prison if they commit crimes, like it should only happen if they've had a fair trial, not if they've had an unfair trial, right? Like, so we should. James Carver at minimum deserves a new trial. That's, I've looked at all this evidence and that's my opinion.
I'm with you on that. I mean, I think I'd even go further at this point, but I mean, that's the minimum. He needs a new trial. We need to
Mhm.
know. I think and if you're a family member of a victim of it, that's what you should probably want too. Like to find out actually, did this guy actually do it? Can they prove that he did it?
Yeah. I mean, it back getting back to that stuff we were talking about the victims, it can reopen a lot of trauma to have this stuff, in the news again or to
Definitely.
have it in court again. But ultimately they deserve the truth, and the public who pays all the tax money for this, justice system deserves the truth. James Carver's family deserves the truth. And James Carver deserves to have the truth out there. They vilified him. They had uh, you know, I have hundreds of newspaper articles about this. He was in the paper every day while this trial was going on, where they were, you know, talking about the evidence supposedly showing that he was guilty. And the public, if they didn't hear it through the rumor mill, they saw it in the newspaper. They saw it.
Yep.
Maybe there were broadcasts on TV. Probably they were
Salem
getting
Evening
this.
News. Back then,
Yeah, they're
everyone
getting this
got
news about it, and he deserves, if that's not the truth, which I don't, I there's at least a different part of the story that didn't get out, and that story should get out. And I think just one other quick point, which is like local media is a shadow of what it once was. We have there used to be a paper called the Beverly Times, and there was also the Salem News. They both covered this story when it happened. The Salem News is kind of the big Essex County paper. Beverly Times was the local paper. Beverly Times at some point was rolled into the Salem News, so now we have one paper. And then, of course, all these papers in Massachusetts have been like shedding people. They've been layoffs, buyouts. There is so little coverage of this story. I was lucky that the way I actually got into this was an article in the Salem News. I saw an article when this motion for a new trial was filed. One of the journalists there, who actually no longer works there, she was like their court reporter, Julie Manganus. She wrote a story about this motion for a new trial. And if I recall correctly, she didn't even write it like right when it was filed in court. She probably heard about it at some point, and or somebody told her about it. I don't know exactly. She wrote about it sometime later. I, am lucky enough that I kind of try to follow a lot of local news. I saw this story, and I got to say, dude, I was like, holy shit when I first, and I got, not even half the story, but the more I read about this story, the more I said like, holy shit, the more I found out about it. Um, but I saw this one article, and then there's maybe been like two or three other articles about the story, short ones in Salem News since then. And I think honestly, it's kind of messed up because like if you are like in the paper every day and they're putting the story about you're the Beverly Times. I don't think they ever specifically called James Carver this, but in sort of the lead up before they had a suspect named in public, they called this case a number of times the worst mass murder in Massachusetts history because 15 people died and they were saying it was a murder. Um, can you imagine they're telling everybody in public, this is the worst mass murder ever in our state, and then it gets pinned on you. And then years later, um, the Boston Globe covered this story, the Associated Press, the National Wire Service covered this story. They haven't said anything about it
of
since,
course. Yeah.
this has happened.
Isn't
And
that the way of the world now? It's
and
just
it's just our court system is unfair, but sort of like, the world is
media too.
unfair, right? Like you get
Yeah,
vilified
the
in the
media
media and then
because it's so
nothing.
true. They will
eh,
cover all your bad news, and then you'll be found innocent, and you're lucky if they put one line in the paper. if the paper even exists anymore. I
Yeah,
mean,
and I'm not even saying this to toot my own horn. I'm saying this because it's like it just reflects kind of it's like a sad state of affairs that some guy with a Substack newsletter is the one who spends all this time digging into the
exactly.
story, and we don't have
You
like
thank God for you. Thank God. Like like YouTube too,
a
like the YouTube shows now.
robust
That's
local media that's going to have
yeah.
an
I
investigative
mean, that's
reporter that's
it.
going to dig
You
into
you
this.
either have a Substack or a YouTube, it seems like, or I mean, that's where people have to go now to for their local news because it just doesn't get covered otherwise. Like the Globe is just not the same. The Salem Evening News definitely is not the same. The Mass Dump is your newsletter, Substack. People can
Mhm,
follow. We put a link at the top of the YouTube chat. Please subscribe to them if you like what you hear. You have a lot of documentation on this case. You have like pictures from the newspapers back in the day, all about this. How did you get them? Did you go like through microfiche? How did you find all the old documentation on this?
Microfilm, microfilm. I went to the Beverly Public Library, the Salem Public Library. I looked at all the microfilm. I scanned it. It took many. It was not even like a 1 day thing. Like I was there multiple days. It was my back hurt by the end of it. I had to pace myself. I did like 1 day a week for a while because if I was crouched over that microfilm machine for every day for like 2 weeks, I would have been like you know, walking around like hunched over all day for a couple months until I got my back straightened out. But yeah, and so those color pictures you see on there, those are from the district attorney's office. They had, I unfortunately, I'm not 100% sure where those pictures came from because there's no like name on them or anything. I believe they were taken though by a dispatcher for the fire department who like lived nearby and he heard it on the police scanner and kind of showed up and he took some pictures with his camera. um, I can't remember his name off the top of my head. I'm not 100% sure if there's pictures, but I have seen his name mentioned in some of the police records, so I kind of assume that they're his pictures. But they're like incredible pictures. Like I hope people will check these out. Like they are, you can see just how
Oh yeah,
massive this fire was, and you can see, um, uh, there's a picture of the guy you mentioned, a guy who jumped out of the building.
yeah. That
He
one
hit
is
his head
brutal.
on a traffic control box, and he died from the head injury. And there's a picture of him,
With the
or
cop.
possibly his body. I
Yeah.
don't know if he was deceased at the time, but on the ground. And um, it's thankfully not too grisly, but it just shows just how horrific this. And they're incredible pictures just documenting this sort of like it's kind of like it's like a historical event, like it's a piece of local history, and that's kind of why I put these pictures out there, just to show that, like, I don't want to, when I talk about when I'm talking about all this stuff casting doubt on the conviction of James Carver, I don't want to in any way undermine the idea that this was like a tragedy. Like this is a serious fire, serious tragedy that killed a lot of people. And uh, I, my stories have been primarily focused on James Carver, but at some point I do want to write about some of these victims and family members and stuff in more depth, because I do think that their stories matter. And the fire department I mentioned, there's a memorial I talked about. They left a note there that I posted on my Substack, just kind of talking about how they said, as we walk through this area, please take a moment to remember those we lost. More importantly, remember them after you leave here. When you're presented with the opportunity to help someone, no matter how small the gesture might be, go ahead and help. You never know what battles they might be facing. And you know, it's like a beautiful sentiment, right? Like we should just we should all be nice to each other, right? And we should help people out. And when we think about tragedies like this, I want to think, instead of thinking about how we need to like punish our way out of it, we need to think about how we can help our way, have more prevention and more fire safety. And we need safe housing, we need safe workplaces, we need housing is such a big issue. I'm sure you talk about it
Huge.
sometimes, and it's you know
So
we could get into the whole shelter thing that's going on, which is really ugly, but it's just, I guess thinking about this story just reminds me that these issues are like ever present. Like people need housing, and it's always been a fight. They, 40 years ago, they were just, discharging people from these
Devastate.
psychiatric hospitals and sticking them in some rooming house that everybody thought was a fire trap, and they die in a fire. And now, in some ways it's even worse. People are just living on the street, right? Like, we
Yeah,
need better options for people. We need more housing,
we
one way
sure
or
do.
another. And that's a big takeaway, that from the story, for me anyway, that these issues haven't been solved, and we need to get to work on them.
Excellent. Well, I hope someone's listening out there at the state house, because I mean, something's got to change in terms of the housing situation, where
Absolutely, yeah.
people just can't afford the rent anymore. The rents have gone up and up and up and up. They need to build a lot of housing. I mean, that's it. They need to
Yeah,
build.
they need to build, and they need to keep people from getting evicted. And I mean, I don't want to editorialize too much about this. I guess I'm here for my thing, but
Yeah.
you're right. Like, we need more housing, and that's just
That's the bottom line. And
that's the bottom line.
I have in the past lived in I actually did at one point live in a boarding house. I know what that's like.
Uh-huh.
It's like not s and, I'm not gonna say what city or town it was in, but the inspectional services came in one day and they were like, "You gotta move out of here. You can't stay here anymore. This place is no sprinklers, no this, no that." I mean, it was just, yeah. That's when I was like, "I'm already out of here. I already got a new place." Like, but I mean, for me, I it was just because you're trying to find a place for a job. You don't want to commute anymore. You're young. You'll live anywhere. And I was like, I'll live here until I find a real place.
Hmm.
And but I know a lot of people, like, they never get out of that. They have this. That's the lifestyle that they have, and it's just, I can't imagine being worried that where you're paying rent, where you're living, could just go up because they don't have things like sprinklers or fire escapes, or just even hand railings going down the stairs, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
just the basics.
Well, the crazy thing is, the building was considered up to code at the
Yeah,
time. They weren't required to have sprinklers, in fact, this fire actually led to a law that, so basically, the zoning, like, or I'm not zoning, I'm sorry, the building codes,
changed.
codes, I should say, there's like limits on how stringent they
Yeah,
could be. So they actually weren't allowed, the city wasn't allowed, I believe, to
yeah,
require
through
them to have
state law.
sprinklers.
Yep,
So they had to pass a state law after this fire that said, yeah, you can require them to have sprinklers in rooming
sprinklers.
houses. And like, that's crazy. Like, to not have sprinklers in a
And
place
if you
where
look at, like,
36
a
people are
lot of the
living.
new places, most of them have the sprinklers. Like,
Mm,
I seen it because, I'm a dog walker, so I go into different complexes, and I notice all the new ones, they all have sprinklers. They all
mm.
seem to have them. But
Yeah, but I mean, there were other issues with the building, like, I mentioned the, like, open stairway, and there were no fire stops, which I don't know. I'm not sure if you can fix that once the building is already up there, but I think they need to be careful. They should have been careful about, like, who they were putting in the building. Like, if the Department of Mental Health is, like, responsible for finding people housing, they should get them dignified housing, not, putting them up in something that people think is gonna be a death trap or something. Like, maybe people have the option to live somewhere like there if they want to, but they should, if the state is placing people somewhere, they have a responsibility to those people to do, right by them, and to not pick something like this. But at the end of the day, I think this fire was a wake up call in terms of, like, the sprinkler issue and some of the coding stuff. But it's like, you gotta you gotta have some foresight. Think about this thing before tragedy happens. Like, it's just, like, kind of obvious that places should have sprinklers, and it shouldn't have taken
yeah,
15
definitely.
people dying for them to fix it. And it's wild. Michael Dukakis, I found him in the newspaper, said at the time, initially, I mean, I believe, I don't know who, I'm actually not sure who eventually signed the bill. It might have been him, but he was saying after the fire that they didn't really want to, like, update the codes because it would cause, like, rent to go up if they had to have more stringent requirements. And that's, like, again, something that's with us today about, like, oh well, if we have to, make your building safe or whatever, it's going to cost you more. And it's like, it's going to cost a lot of money if a bunch
Bunch of people
people
die.
die, and then they start suing the people who own the building for negligence or whatever too, right? Like, how we need to have like some foresight and think about this stuff before something goes wrong, rather than being reactive. But I don't know, man. There's a lot to this, and it's I, I sort of I've been focused a lot in my writing and like police misconduct and things like that. I never sort of thought I would be thinking too much about like um, housing and building codes and fires and fire safety and stuff like that. But really, it just stuff like this goes to show how everything is connected in like our sort of, I don't know, so what do you call it, like a social political reality, our material reality, like all this stuff, like our police, our justice system, and our housing. It's all connected in some way, one way or another. And uh, if you don't like think about the big picture, stuff goes wrong.
That's for sure. I mean, I'm sure you were not surprised about the Karen Reed stuff with like multiple police officers being suspended and just like just a lot of controversy about the police officers themselves in that case. You've seen it a lot, haven't you? Like a lot of
Yeah, I mean,
police misconduct.
I I didn't follow the Karen really thing religiously, but I would turn on like Law and Crime while I was having lunch and see some of the recaps. I read some of the news articles. I saw like Ted Daniel on Twitter, some of his like live tweets of it. So I did absorb a lot of that information, and it's crazy stuff. But what struck me the most about the Karen Reed thing is how the stuff about like Michael Proctor and some of the other cops and stuff clearly is what they call Brady material, meaning it's possible it's potentially exculpatory evidence, which means that the prosecution and the police have a legal ethical duty to provide it to the defense. But from what I understand, the defense wouldn't have gotten it unless this federal investigation
Bingo.
hadn't happened and hadn't uncovered it. And that you know is obviously very troubling. Like, if it takes a federal investigation, what happens in like literally every other criminal case where there isn't a federal
Exactly.
investigation, or like what other stuff, like uh, just because it's on a cop's personal cell phone doesn't mean it's not related to the investigation. And if we don't have anybody who's like I hate this expression, but like policing the police, uh, just think of all the stuff they're getting away with. I mean, just look at all the stuff that's happened in the past 10 years with the drug. I mentioned this before, but the drug lab scandals, the the
Can we? I want to actually go circle around to that because this is it's so interesting that you brought up um, so many of the scandals, right? Because one that came out recently and that's been around for a while was the Boston police had a drug scandal, drug lab scandal, and no one seemed to get fired. They like moved. There was something going on, and I know there
are you
was.
talking about the evidence room
Yeah, yeah,
where
yeah.
there were, I think, people charged over that. I don't know all the details
No, I don't think anyone ever. Do you know if anyone ever got charged? I don't think anyone ever got charged for that.
for the evidence, the overtime thing. Is that what you're talking about?
Well,
Or
that's what I'm saying. This is okay.
yeah, I think
So
some people were
so
charged for that. Some of
well
them, I
that
think, were
no, that's where I'm going. You're giving it away.
okay.
So when there was an evidence room scandal with the Boston police a couple decades ago, and I
Oh,
know for a
decades ago. Okay.
fact that they were selling cocaine out of that evidence room.
Okay.
I know
Uh,
people who were addicts who bought drugs from the Boston police from their evidence room. One of the people that told me about it would never go on the record to talk about it, but he told me privately he's dead now.
mhm,
But he used to buy drugs from the cops out of that evidence room.
mhm.
There was a scandal about it. The Globe reported on it briefly. The guys got like investigated, but no one went to jail. But guess what? Some of those guys are going to jail now because now they've done payroll fraud.
Mhm.
So I mean, it's like if you don't deal with the with a problem right then, guess what? It's not going to go away. They're going to continue to do crime. I mean, it
Yeah,
just
the one about the Boston police that always gets to me is the Patrick Rose thing,
yeah.
where they had this guy who, it was in the Boston Globe. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with it, but he was a child molester, and he, like, almost his entire career as a like 30 years as a cop, or it might have been 20, 25 years. He was molesting children, and they found out that about one of the victims, like within a few years of him joining the police department. They investigated it. They believed that it happened, and then they just kind of swept it under the rug and let him be a cop. And he kept molesting children for like another couple decades or whatever.
And then he became the
and
head of the
and then he
union.
became the head of the police union, who was representing all the cops. And then he didn't get arrested until after he retired. And
And I think he looted the police union too, didn't he? Is that am I right?
that I don't know about.
No, it was his buddy, I think. I don't know. Someone
but
yeah, go
but
ahead.
how could people not, like, if there were at least some people in the department who knew about it? It must have been a rumor. There must have been a lot of people who knew about it, but yet he became like the president of the police union. And it's just like obscene. Like, it's one of the like worst things I've ever heard. It's just like it's grotesque. It's like abominable.
And especially
Um,
them, because they're the ones that like the loudest police union, Boston Patrolmen.
mhm.
And they're also the ones that aren't saying anything about John O'Keefe's death. They're not showing up for John O'Keefe, which is very interesting in itself. But I want to thank you for being here. People are asking, do you have a YouTube too? You don't have a YouTube channel, do you?
I
Or you
have a
do?
YouTube channel, but I don't know. It's
You
a
don't have
little.
to
I don't use it actively. I used to do a podcast. You can listen to it on there. And I used it to upload some like videos I got through public records requests. Like, I did this story about a alleged police brutality incident, and the videos there. It's not like a with commentary. It's just like the raw video I got from the police department. Stuff like that. So it's not something that I'm like, you're not going to
promoting.
like see an active like live show like this on it. But if you can certainly look it up if you want. But if you want to see the writing I do, that's probably what you're more interested in. It's the mass dump. You can just Google it. It's andrewqmr.substack.com, but it's probably easier to just Google the mass dump. I think it shows up before the listing for your local dump, uh, in the Google search results, so you should be able to find it pretty easily.
Awesome.
Um, but yeah, the first page of it has all the James Carver stories. The long one, which I wrote before the hearing, but it's got like probably most of the details in it. It's currently the last story on the front page. It's the one that I think you're linking to. That's the one I would recommend people check out if they're really interested in it. It's pretty long though. It's like 10,000 words. If you want a somewhat shorter one, the most recent or second most recent story is about the like closing arguments at the hearing. That's if you want like a somewhat shorter read, that one might be more up your alley. But yeah, definitely check it out. It's put a lot of work into it, and I'm going to be writing more when we get the ruling from the judge, and maybe I'll come back on or something. We can talk about it. But I can't tell you when that's going to be. These judges, they don't have deadlines,
Yeah, they don't have
so
a
they can take
timetable.
as long as they want. We might not know for like another year or something, but uh, my guess is it's going to be at least a few more months. Maybe like could be like 6 months from the date of the hearing or something. But I definitely encourage people to financially support my work, because it's a lot of work to bring like even one story like this. And you know the stuff you get from the Salem News, which by the way they have a paywall, so you got to pay for that too anyway. But their coverage of this was, again, not to brag, but it wasn't as good as mine. They didn't do as much work as I did. And in fairness, they probably can't like
No, they can't. They got to
afford to
go on
do
to
it.
the
Like,
next
I'm not
day.
I'm not even trying to like knock them.
Yeah.
I'm just saying like local
It's a
media, like
different job. That like
they're doing
one
daily news
story a
reporting.
day, one story
Yep.
a day, and it's like next day they don't have time to spend weeks and travel out to Beverly like you did to go
Mhm.
to the library and pull out all the records. Like nobody has that time in
Yeah, not
broadcast
just the
media
library. I
anymore.
had to go to the court. I went with my scanner. I scanned the documents myself. It, I think the court clerks probably got used to me being there for a while, because I literally showed up with my own computer and scanner and would just go through. I'd remove the staples, I'd scan them, I'd staple them back together, put it back, and I got, everything. And, I even managed, I'm not going to say how I got this, but I even managed to get the impounded court records. So these are like the documents where they're too sensitive to be viewed by the public, and the judge will say these aren't public, only the lawyers can view them. I managed to get a copy of all of those. I have like the secret grand jury transcripts. I have, police reports and stuff. So like when I say I'm like have this opinion of this case, it's based on like basically all the evidence that's available. Like it's, I've literally seen stuff that the public isn't allowed to see. And getting all this stuff was a lot of work, and would definitely appreciate if people appreciate the work. I would appreciate them showing their appreciation with some money. But if you can't afford to, totally cool. But if you can, definitely would I would appreciate it, as I said.
The Mass Dump, check it out, and it's definitely put in your email and subscribe.
Yeah, and thanks for having me on. I love talking about this stuff, and we did a pretty long show. I think I was able to get into it pretty thoroughly, but I think there's still more stuff that people will find if they want to read it. And in particular, again, I mentioned check out the pictures. It's just an
Yeah, it tells a
incredible.
story.
Yeah,
That's what I love. I love the pictures, the documentation you provided too, additionally, and all the writing. So definitely check that out. Thank you so much for being here, Andrew Cormier.
yeah.
Check him
Thanks for
out,
having
the
me.
Mass Dump. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
All right, really appreciate it.
And my name is Mike Crawford. I want to thank everybody who's been watching and supporting. I thank our new member tonight, Jeannie, who signed up. I want to thank Miss Shorty for the donation. David Reese gave a donation tonight. A couple of them, actually. Thank you, David. All right. Friday night. We'll be back Friday night. I'm not sure of the time. It probably 6 or 6:30. Time to be determined, but it's going to be Bettero and Mazza and myself. The 3Ms are going to be back together on Friday night right here. So stay tuned. And if you haven't, please subscribe. I know I'm very thankful. We got over 36,000 subscribers now, but YouTube tells me that half of you that watch the show still haven't subscribed. So I'm still talking to half of you. Please hit that subscription button, hit that like button, hit that subscription button, support us. I want to thank you so much. And again, if you want to follow Andrew, his Substack is listed at the top of our YouTube chat tonight. You can click right in there, subscribe to him as well. If you're watching it on the YouTube replay, I'll pin that in the comment section too as well. So check that out. I think it's also in the description on the video tonight too. You can probably also find it right there. Thank you so much, Andrew, for being here tonight. And thank you, our moderators. We got MJ was there tonight. I saw her, Stephanie, Jenon, and Miss Shorty. Thank you so much, our moderators. We'll see you again on Friday night. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your week. We'll see you